This is Plymouth Plantation and the Wampanoag home site. The area you are seeing now is the Wampanoag home site. All of the staff that work in the Wampanoag area are also all native people, either from Wampanoag or a different native nation. Here you can ask questions about the historical and modern times of the Wampanoags and can see firsthand what activities the Wampanoags may have been doing when the colonists arrived in Massachusetts. These activities include weaving, cooking, or sometimes carving a canoe from a tree. When cooking, they only use ingredients that could be found back in the 17th century when the colonists arrived to Massachusetts. You could also see them doing other activities that they did then and now, like fishing or working in the garden. Can also go inside the house or wigwam built by the Wampanoags and can see what went inside the homes and how small or large they could be. This is the inside of one of the wigwams at the Wampanoag home site. This is what most of the Wampanoags had in their houses at the time that the colonists arrived. There is a fire at the bottom to help keep the area warm, with a vent at the top to let the smoke out.
I got a question for you.
Yes, sir.
What were the differences between men and women's roles in the Wampanoag village?
Look at him with a smile. Your role is very easy. You get married as a man, right? And you're going to take life and alter. Women give life and sustain. Very easy. You do the hunting and I'll do the tanning. The garden belongs to the women. If I want to fish, you're going to go out there and get me a fish. And if I specify what kind, you better come back. We eat red meat mostly in the winter time. It's when we eat the deer. That's why we go inland, because we can track the big animals in the snow. We need the fat from that animal in the winter time to keep warm too. This time of year, we're eating fish. The berries, well, if we'd had a decent spring, the berries would be ripe, but I don't even see a berry. But anyhow, you're eating fish most of the summer. Like anything flying, ducks, geese, but that's your job to get them down. I will leave your bag for you. Sometimes, though, I don't know, you guys can answer that. Women would make your skins and bleach cloth or beadwork, but sometimes the men want to do their own, so to each his own on that.
That's true.
But you will provide, and we will sustain. Does that answer your question? Okay?
Oh, yeah, it does. Thank you so much.
You have like a superior sex, like the English do, so women can be chiefs.
So you're wearing a lot of rings.
Tower makes some noise, keeps pests out of your garden. A lot of games are hand-eye coordination, so that's really helpful. You have to be completely self-sufficient before people will even consider you, able to be an adult. So girls and boys would have to be able to do everything. Everything, like hunting, fishing, making your own clothes. Then, if you are considered an adult, right, and perhaps you find someone you fell in love with them and now you are married, you'll split up the work. So that's kind of where you get those tasks from. But I always like to say, you have to be considered self-sufficient first. Because there is a split up of work, but only to create a balance, right? For instance, if I were a married woman and I wanted to go hunt that day, well, it's not like I'm forbidden to do it. But most likely I'd be doing other things. You see, women can naturally give birth, so they would be doing life-giving and life-sustaining things. And then, well, you can't, we don't make you, so they would do life-taking and life-altering things. But I do enjoy how it works its way into the actual daily life.
I really regret wearing
This is the English village side. This is where you can talk to the pilgrims and ask them about their time in Plymouth. But you can't ask them about anything modern because they don't know anything about modern times. These are some clips of us talking with a few of the colonists that live there.
Good morning.
You're welcome to come inside.
What are you up to?
Doing a little dusting now, but I'm also making as a medicine.
What kind of medicine?
It's physic that's good for your brain and good for your stomach. It's a conserve made with the flowers of sage. Conserve is any herb or flour that you pound in a mortar with some sugar. so that will make it last for a little longer.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh no, you're
Please
alright.
continue.
Where are you visiting from?
South Carolina.
You've come a long way, methinks.
Yeah, we've
Yeah,
come a
it has
long
been
way.
England.
A long way.
Well, welcome to the town.
Thank you.
Did you travel here by ship?
Of course.
Yeah.
That's how we all came here as well, though truthfully, we all come on different ships.
Yeah.
My husband, he have been here since the beginning, since 1620. And I myself come later in 1623.
Where'd you guys come from?
We had all been living in the Netherlands, but we are also all born in England, though in different parts as well. I was born in Somerset in England, which is in the west. But my husband was born more in the north.
Ulsterfield in the north. Yorkshire.
Thomas born elsewhere too.
Yes, and I in the south in Canterbury.
What were you all just doing outside?
Taking out the carpet. You keep carpets where you're from.
Of course.
Yeah, so you've got to air them out so they don't get dirty. And you didn't want anything to get spilled on it when it was on the table. So, something that should be done when the weather is applicable. Same with your bedding.
Right.
Yeah, it's good weather for it today.
What do you guys put in your bed and what are you guys sleeping on?
That might be feathers, yeah, or sometimes straw. You can't feel the one behind you there. I think that one's filled with feathers, actually.
You mentioned you were making medicine. Are you in charge of the healthcare of your family?
I am, yeah. So every housewife will know how to make zimples, such as I am making. But if it is something that is beyond my skill, then there is a surgeon here as well. I'm Samuel Fuller. So if my family had a toothache, I could make medicine for that. But if the tooth needed to be pulled, then you would go to the surgeon. So we grow herbs in our gardens that we brought the original seeds from England. And then every year, of course, you let things go to seed, let those seeds dry, and then you can save it for the next year. Nothing ails you now, does it?
No, man.
Do you grow anything else in your garden?
Yeah, it's also herbs for cooking. So there's things like radishes and parsnips and carrots and cabbages. And things like sage and marjoram and thyme and parsley.
Okay.
Do you all grow honey?
If you want to call it that, yeah, there's
Yeah.
not much sport to it. It's mostly just shooting birds.
Nice.
They block out the sun when they come back. It's not very difficult to hit them, especially with the ale shot. You know, small little pellets. That being said, we are permitted to take of any game in the country, so even venison, cranes, swans, gunnies. Nothing is protected here. Yeah, so good food.
Canterbury and all this sort of nonsense. And, well, the Christian religion isn't that way. It's not supposed to be that way. That's our notion, and our king feels otherwise. And that's why out here live in the middle of nowhere. We don't agree with the king. But out here we are trying to achieve what we call the primitive church. The church, the way it was in those moments, in those years just after Christ had left the world. And when he'd left the church, we're trying to get back to their primitive state. Because our notion is that some things that we do as Christians are things because we do because God told us to do them. And yet other things we do are habits we picked up over the course of time. And some of them are harmless and some of them maybe not. But we're trying to strip it back to the simplest form, to its primitive church. And since the world's going to end pretty soon, you know, there's not going to be any 1700, is there? It's going to be all over. It's pretty clear if you look at the events of the last 10 years. Jesus.
This is the Salem Witch Trials Proctor's Ledge Memorial that was recently built. And by recently, I mean as early as 2017. This memorial is placed where it was found that Proctor's Ledge was and memorializes those 19 people who were hung there during the witch trials. It wasn't always said that Proctor's Ledge was here. It was considered to be somewhere else until researchers in 2016 pinpointed it to here. This is the Old North Church, where Paul Revere did his famous signal with lanterns, one if by land, two if by sea. Lanterns were to be hung in the steeple of the church, which was the highest point in Boston at the time, to alert the people to know what the British Army were doing. Old North Church is Boston's oldest surviving church, and even today still holds services every Sunday and is still an active church. Many people every day go to the church and go to services. The church is an Episcopal church, which is the closest thing America has to the Anglican church from Britain. The church is large and has boxes instead of pews like you normally would see in today's churches, as it was an older church and has not been renovated, really. Stand your ground, don't fire unless fired upon, but if they mean to have a war, let it begin here. Said by Captain Parker in Lexington on the Lexington Commons, now known as the Lexington Battle Green. It was here that the first shots of the Battle of Lexington and Concord were fired and started the Revolutionary War. 77 men stood here and fought against the British soldiers. The first monument shown was built in 1799 to honor those 8 men who died on the green on April 19, 1775. This monument here is a statue to memorialize the Minutemen in Lexington and was built in 1900.
Buried at this grave are 2 British soldiers from the fighting in Concord at the Old North Bridge in 1775. On the evening of April 18, 1775, General Thomas Gage sent 700 British soldiers to Concord to seize and destroy military ammunition that was stored in bulk at the town. At this point, General Gage still hoped he could convince the colonists to stand down and avoid war. British soldiers secured the north and south bridges to prevent rebels from notifying other colonists about the British mission. The Minuteman statue now stands on the west side of the river at the North Bridge. At about 9 a.m., the militiamen thought the town was being set on fire, so they marched to the bridge in enormous numbers. The British retreated to Boston, and the War of Independence had begun. Now we go to the old man's house, which overlooked the North Bridge. This house is where Ralph Waldo Emerson stayed for some time. He was here when the battle at Concord happened, which spurred him to write his Concord hymn, which was sung at the completion of the battle monument on July 4th in 1837. The year is 1775. The colonists learned that the British were planning to send troops from Boston to occupy the surrounding city, so colonial militiamen fortified Breed's Hill, which was smaller and closer to Boston. On June 17th, British forces landed in Charlestown and marched to Breed's Hill. When the British soldiers were within several dozen yards, the American soldiers fired, which, after some retreat, turned into hand combat. The American colonists were outnumbered and forced to retreat, but they had killed around 200 British soldiers and wounded 800. On the other hand, the colonists lost around 100 and about 300 other soldiers were wounded. The British won the battle and kept Charlestown under British control, but still, the battle showed that the Americans actually stood a chance against the British, and that the war would be a long, tough, and costly effort. To commemorate this event, in 1843, a 221-foot granite obelisk was built as a monument. The monument is located on Breed's Hill, where most of the fighting took place. Now that we've learned some history, let's climb some stairs. Okay.
Rapunzel, let down your hair.
Okay, guys. We're here.
I want to die.
We made it.
Did we really?
Yeah.
I'm so sure. Oh. Okay. There's the view. Yeah, pretty cool.
This is the Longfellow House, located in Cambridge, Massachusetts, near Harvard University. This is the house that George Washington occupied and made his headquarters during the Siege of Boston. He lived in the house from July 16, 1775, until April 4, 1776. Later on, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow became the owner in 1843 after receiving the house as a wedding gift. He was one of the greatest poets of the 19th century and a very influential man in Boston. Today, the house operates as a museum, and tours are given by the National Park Service, seasonally. All of the original artwork is still in the house, and a lot of the house is still original. Today, you can walk throughout the house and walk through the home of both Henry Wadsworth Longfellow and George Washington. There are beautiful gardens surrounding the house, and it's crazy to think that these two men once lived here. This is the statue of William Lloyd Garrison. William Lloyd Garrison was an influential journalist. He was also an abolitionist, suffragist, and social reformer. He founded and edited the abolitionist newspaper, The Liberator, and was a founding member of the American Anti-Slavery Society. This statue stands in the Copley area of Boston. Today, you can walk through the Copley area, and located near this statue is also the statue of Phyllis Wheatley, which provides for some great views. We all know a little something or two about George Washington. Whether it was that he was the first president of our nation, or that he could not tell a lie, the point is, we all know who he is. He was a very prominent figure in Boston during the 1700s. He spent a considerable amount of time in the Boston area from the spring of 1775 through the spring of 1776. Why? Because he had to. The siege of Boston was underway as the first major military contest of the American Revolution. This is the George Washington statue located in the Boston Gardens. The statue represents Washington at the time of middle life, and the countenance and attitude are full of force and vigor. Faces to the south. The location of the statue is what is most attractive about it. It is one of the finest parts of the garden, surrounded by flowers, giving tourists and Bostonians alike a great view while walking through the gardens. No matter how you put it, walking through these gardens, you will see George Washington, and you will be reminded of how he contributed to the city of Boston and how it is today. This is the Boston Massacre Monument. It stands at 25 feet high and 10 feet wide. On top stands a figure representing the spirit of the Revolution, inspired by Eugene Delacroix's painting of Liberty Leading the People, a symbol of the French Revolution. She holds a broken chain in her right hand to symbolize freedom from the oppressors, and in her left hand she holds the American flag. With her right foot, she crushes the crown of the British monarchy, and next to her other foot, an eagle prepares to fly. This statue has a great representation as well. It represents the willingness of African Americans to fight oppression, even in their oppressed state. The next time you take a walk through Boston Gardens and see this monument, you will have a strong sense of freedom. The Robert Gould Shaw and Massachusetts 54th Regiment Memorial is located on Beacon Street, right across from the State House. It serves as a reminder of the heavy cost paid by individuals and families during the Civil War. In particular, it serves as a reminder of the recruitment of the first black troops allowed to fight in the Civil War. Black troops were previously allowed to fight in the Revolutionary and War of 1812, yet weren't allowed to fight in the Civil War until Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation made it possible for free black men to do so. This monument serves as a reminder today that without the help of these black soldiers, things could have severely taken a turn for the worse for the Union. Who knows where our country would be today without the help of these black men and the sacrifices they made for their country. This is the Granary Cemetery. It was built in order to help alleviate overcrowding in the King's Chapel Burying Ground, which is located nearby. It is estimated that there are about 2,345 gravestones on site, although it is believed that around 5,000 people are buried here. This is the final resting place of some of Boston and America's most important men, such as Paul Revere, Samuel Adams, and John Hancock. There's a monument in the middle of the cemetery that is dedicated to Benjamin Franklin's parents. Along with these men, the five victims of the Boston Massacre are also buried here. It is crazy to think that while walking through these grounds, you're walking on some of the most important and prominent men in Boston in the 1700s. They helped shape the city into what it is today, and without them, things would be a whole lot different now. This is the inside of the old State House. Built in 1713, this is one of the most historic buildings in Boston. It served as the seat of the Massachusetts General Court until 1798, making it one of the oldest public buildings in the United States. It now operates as a history museum and gift shop operated by the Bostonian Society. Outside, tourists have a chance to see the site of the Boston Massacre. This was a deadly riot that occurred between American colonists and one British soldier, but this quickly escalated and left 5 young men dead. The conflict energized anti-British sentiment and paved the way for the American Revolution. Nowadays, this is a popular tourist destination. You can go to the museum, learn some cool facts, buy a couple t-shirts, and stand where those would have stood who died in the Boston Massacre. This is Faneuil Hall. Built in 1742, this building was home to merchants, fishermen, and other settlers, and provided a platform for the country's most famous speakers, such as Samuel Adams. This is the building where colonists first protested the Sugar Act in 1764, and came about with the phrase, "No taxation without representation." Today, Faneuil Hall is still a strong central marketplace in Boston. There are a number of different restaurants and shops to enjoy, and see a number of live performances.
The year is 1812. Great Britain and France were at war over who would dominate Europe and the world. In Britain's efforts to control the world's oceans, the Royal Navy took away American soldiers' rights and cut into trade. In response, the United States declared war on Britain. They had taken America's ships and crew members, but what could such a new power do about it? The fighting broke out both on land and on water. Here we are on the USS Constitution, a ship that made 4 successful cruises during the war and defeated 4 Royal Navy ships in combat. Here we are on the USS Constitution. Let's take a look around. If you were a sailor on the USS Constitution, life was a lot of work. And if you were Dylan's height, you probably had some trouble getting around. A ship, of course, has to be operating 24/7, so the crew all rotated between eating, working, and sleeping. The day was divided up into 5 watch periods that were 4 hours long, and 2 dog watch periods, which were each 2 hours long. The ship's bell rang every half hour, starting with 1 bell at the start of the watch. 8 bells meant the beginning of a new watch. Sailors did the same weekly duties of ship maintenance, washing, and exercising, but they also had free time where they would write, share stories, and even play games. Say goodbye to the USS Constitution. We're moving on.
Like the videos you just seen are how the factories were in Loyal. During this time, it was mostly young women and girls working in the factory. They ranged from the age of 15 to 35. They also got paid about $3 to $4 per week, which they had to also pay for the boarding house they lived in. The young girls mostly worked about 9 to 10 months out of the year, but they left during the summer to go back home to visit families on the farm. The girls worked in the textiles for about 12 to 14 hours a day and was half days on Saturdays but were off on Sundays. These young female workers went on strike when the mill owners reduced the wages and sped up the pace of the work. In these 2 pictures, it shows how the mill girls looked when they arrived to the mills and how they looked after working in the mills. During this time, the ladies lived in a boarding house. The boarding house was kept over by a woman keeper. There were about 8 units to about 20 to 40 women. The bedrooms came to about 3 to 4 ladies in each of them, and the ladies had to pay $1.25 a week to stay here. The African American History Museum has nearly 100 photos of Frederick Douglass. He was an escaped slave from Maryland who became an activist, an author, and a public speaker. He also was the leader of the abolition movement. The next couple photos you're about to see are photos of the African Meeting House that was built in 1806. The house was the first African Baptist church in Boston. It's one of the oldest African churches still standing in America today.
Yeah, that's not the difference. I'm heading up, bro.
In 1939, the presidential library system officially began when President Roosevelt left his estate for some of his friends who decided to turn it into a library and museum. Similar to this first, all presidential libraries are built by private, nonprofit organizations and then ran by the National Archives and Records Administration. Before he died, President John F. Kennedy chose a site next to Harvard University for the Kennedy Library. After Kennedy died, his family began planning for the JFK Library, which should have 3 parts: a museum, an archive, and an educational institute. The Kennedy Library Corporation raised more than $20.8 million for both the construction of the JFK Presidential Library and Museum for an institute at Harvard for the study of politics and public affairs. Each of the exhibits in the Kennedy Library Museum was developed by first setting in general guidelines and themes, second searching for objects, pictures, and documents that best fit those themes, and then the Kennedy family representatives met to approve the items. The family met about 45 times to complete the library. Many also offered their own items for display, including letters, trophies, and other personal items. The building was completed and dedicated in October of 1979. Next, let's talk about JFK himself. John F. Kennedy got his start when he attended Harvard College in 1936. While he was not very ambitious about the government, he became more intrigued when his father was appointed United States Ambassador to England and he moved there with his family. John, who had the nickname of Jack, wrote constantly with his father about World War II. After graduating from Harvard, John and his brother joined the Navy. JFK served in the war and was awarded the Navy and Marine Corps Medal for his leadership and courage. After the war, John ran for Congress and began his political career. He would serve for 3 terms in the House and 1 in the Senate. After being elected senator, John married Jacqueline, and then he was nominated as the Democratic Party's presidential nominee on July 13, 1960. At only 43, Kennedy was the youngest person elected as president and the first Catholic. In Kennedy's inaugural speech, he spoke his famous quote, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." He asked the nations of the world to join together to fight what he called the common enemies of man: tyranny, poverty, disease, and war itself. President Kennedy created the Peace Corps, which is a program that still exists today and allows Americans to volunteer to work anywhere in the world where assistance is needed. Kennedy was also determined to catch up with the Soviet Union in its space program, so he asked Congress to approve more than $22 billion for Project Apollo, which had the goal of landing a man on the moon before the end of the decade. One of the biggest problems that President Kennedy faced was racial discrimination. In 1954, the Supreme Court ruled that segregation was not allowed, but many Southern schools did not follow this law. With pushed efforts from Martin Luther King Jr., Kennedy proposed a new civil rights bill in 1963 and went on TV asking for Americans to end racism. He made it clear that everyone should live a happy life, regardless of their skin color. The same year, on November 21st, President Kennedy was shot in Dallas, Texas by Harvey Lee Oswald. The nation grieved over Kennedy's death, and we will always remember him today in the Presidential Library. He was always optimistic and believed that no problem was unsolvable if we worked together.